Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logging on from in the world, and welcome to this latest Infrastructure Intelligence webinar, part of our Infrastructure Intelligence Live series organised in association with communications consultancy BECG. And today we're looking at what I think is a very topical subject of placemaking and how that is contributing to the government's efforts to level up the country. A lot of talk from the UK government at the moment about the north-south. They wouldn't call it a divide, but they talk about levelling up and the need to invest in those areas that have been left behind. And I think the concept of placemaking and connecting people around the country is one that is obviously extremely important to that levelling up agenda, and particularly as we, let's hope, let's cross all of our fingers, enter a post-COVID environment. There's all sorts of talk about, the concept of a 15-minute, 20-minute, call it what you want, neighborhood, where basically everything that anyone could need within reason for life is actually within a short walk or bike ride of their local community. Placemaking, I think it's fair to say, has never been more important, and the access, particularly to public spaces, better infrastructure, we've seen the importance of that raised during the course of the pandemic. I know the government are trying to improve matters by, I was going to say tweaking, some would say tearing up the planning laws and the planning processes. And no doubt there'll be some conversation amongst our panelists today about planning. Of course, these things don't go in a straight line. The government lost the recent Cheshire and Amersham by-election unexpectedly, largely due, many people say, to dissatisfaction with the planning laws. So there's a political balancing act, isn't there, to be gained, to be had by the government in terms of holding on to its support in these new so-called ex-Red Wall areas, and it's maybe more traditional support in the south. So there's a conundrum for the government to grapple with going forward. Anyway, I'm sure we're going to have an excellent discussion today with a very knowledgeable panel on this question of levelling up and placemaking. And it's a panel that's made up of Anya Martin from MacDonald, Stephen Tomlinson from LCR, Ruth Jeffs from Waterman, Shawn Keys from Sutcliffe, and Kevin Whitmore from BECG. And I'll introduce all of those in turn as they speak. Our first speaker, though, our first panelist, is Anya Martin, who's a technical director at MacDonald. Anya has a number of skills, and we don't have time to go into all of those today, but I know that she's been involved in working across different sectors to address the challenges that are posed by growing populations and the impact of that on people. I know she's had particular involvement in focusing on emerging technologies and their role in placemaking. And I know that at all times she encourages a multidisciplinary approach to master planning and is particularly keen to promote the importance of holistic thinking. Anyway, that's enough from me. Anya, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Appreciate the introduction. So as Andy said, my name is Anya Martin, and I am the European City Director in Mott MacDonald. I'm delighted to talk about placemaking and the impact that the government's levelling up agenda is having on that, and the role that the construction sector can actually play in this. Today, I'm really going to focus on three main themes. The first one, and the most important one, is actually about creating places for people. Second idea that I've got pulling across is how we put sustainability at the centre to drive that place-based approach, so we can achieve our net zero targets that we're as a community we're absolutely focusing on. And that is about focusing on the social outcomes. It's about understanding active travel. It's about really delivering that green space understanding and promoting well-being. It's about access and inclusivity for all. And the third bit that is really important to really focus on is how we use these ideals to drive growth in our communities and our towns and centres, and to drive affordable living for everybody. We've been hit by this pandemic, and wow, has it really changed our lives. It's changed how we work, it's changed how we live, it's changed how we play. And we've got some amazing opportunity now coming out of this pandemic as to really shape and focus how we move forward and how our communities move forward in the future. The government is putting a significant amount of money in to how we can build our way out of this pandemic. They've set up this levelling up agenda and the levelling up a number of funds to actually address this disparity in our local in our communities and in our country, and it's how we make the most of those. Our city centres have really been hit significantly. There was a trend of demise anyway in our city centres and town centres moving forward, with a focus on online retail and the local planning policies. But now we really have the opportunity to focus on that physical regeneration of our towns and cities and our communities, and really improve that connectivity. It's about repurposing those buildings and how do we get the most out of those areas to improve the community as a whole. It really is about that place-based agenda, that spatial proximity and creation of those mixed-use walkable neighbourhoods that lead to more active travel. It's that modal shift of improving footfall, health and well-being, benefiting all and including green space. That new localism, that social justice, that access, those social outcomes, the tangible impacts now that we have on our citizens, and the legacy that we want to push down to the generations coming up. It is that trend to understand how we build in resilience and that sustainability impact into our placemaking and what that works on. Andy actually did mention the 20-minute city, and we've got the opportunity to really make that work by using sustainable transport to develop equitable distribution of our core amenities, whether it be shops, doctors, schools, public transport stops, to improve that transport network. And I think we have this shift in that attitude from in the radial cities around towns and cities around the larger cities in our areas, and how we change that commuting model. I know myself, I probably am not going to go back and work in the office 5 days a week, and looking at that mixed way of how we work, live and play in our areas is a really good opportunity for us to look at the planning and how we plan around our transport and how we improve connectivity to push affordability post-COVID for everybody and really drive that economic stimulus that we need to develop. It really is about that new localism, the importance of place, delivering and developing that green infrastructure to get people together and driving that social outcomes for everybody. So we've got something that we can focus and develop on. An interesting opportunity of that is, looking at this triple access planning opportunities that we have, looking at the land use system and that spatial proximity of things adjoining each other, about the connectivity, whether that's through telecommunications, whether it's through digital apps, and how that actually works. And then it's about the transport system, that physical mobility, and how we can drive more of a sustainable way of looking at that and delivering it. We now have the construction playbook that has been brought out by the government that actually looks in that construction sector of how we improve our building process and our workspace and safety, how we drive innovation and growth and that sustainability to hit our 2050 net zero targets, and how we can promote those social values in the post-COVID world and push an economic growth, improve inequalities, and improve well-being in our industry. And the principle really is how do we transform, how do we assess and procure public works and those type of programs. And that is going to be a very important way of us being able to deliver this new placemaking in our future that we're looking to deliver. I think that's all I actually have to say at this precise moment in time, Andy. I covered quite a lot of topics in that very small space, but hopefully we can have a larger discussion on some of those topics later. So back to you.
Thanks very much, Anya. I think some really interesting points made there. Really pleased to hear you talk about the importance of affordability, I think, which is something that can be forgotten in a lot of the discussions around levelling up and placemaking. I think, you know, there's going to be a lot of hopefully a lot of development, and a lot of development done by organizations and companies within the construction and infrastructure sector, but at the end of the day, they've got to be accessible and usable, and above all affordable by by communities. And I think it's really important to stress that going forward. I'm sure we're going to come back to some of those issues in the discussion. Our next speaker is Stephen Tomlinson, who is the Senior Station Development Manager at LCR. For those that aren't aware of the work of LCR, they have significant expertise in placemaking, commercial development and asset management, and they've been involved in some of the UK's most significant regeneration schemes, including the redevelopment around St Pancras and King's Cross, and also the master planning at Stratford City. I know that Stephen has got significant experience and insights on transport-focused development as well. And I can't think of anyone better to be our second speaker. So over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Andy. So I'm Stephen Tomlinson. Thanks for the intro. And I head up design and placemaking for LCR across England. And as was introduced, LCR have quite a history of placemaking, and particularly bringing previously challenged areas back or into good use through regeneration. 20 years ago, who would have imagined King's Cross as it is now, as part of a place-based but transport-orientated development? It's completely undergone significant change. Similarly, Stratford, which centred around, in terms of our land ownership, into the international station, obviously, and the rail lands there have undergone huge change and brought big changes to that part of East London. I personally worked on the Olympics on Stratford prior to joining LCR, and where transport-centred development around places like Hackney Wick and Fish Islands were really brought about through growing those places, enhancing what's there, and really, rather than coming in and presenting a kind of a top-down strategy, is really working with kind of what's bubbling up under the surface and using that to kind of best effect. Now, LCR, we're looking to bring our experience to bear all over England, and our largest project in the northwest is Manchester Mayfield. So that's bringing Manchester's largest park for 100 years. We've recently, we're working in partnership with Manchester City Council, TFGM, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and U+I, our development partner. And we've recently secured £23 million from the government Get Building fund. So now we're kind of, those larger projects, we're looking at becoming more involved with smaller stations, and I think our starting point is always collaborating with local partners. So the kind of three themes I'm going to talk about are collaboration and positive change in communities, public value, and unlocking complex sites. And I think that's kind of sums up what we're about. We always start looking outwardly, and who can we bring in, and how can we make the projects kind of as encompassing as in getting the local partners involved as possible. So what role do we play in top quality placemaking? Well, I think just bringing complex sites forward is one huge element of that. I mean, as we've seen by King's Cross, but doing that on a smaller scale and bringing those sites back into use is hugely important, and that can be within suburban stations and not just major centres. And we lever the skill sets of our partners and get that kind of energy involved from a local outset to kind of bring those projects through from beginning to the end. And we are, as King's Cross, we're in it for the long-term game rather than short-term gains. So we're in it for the long term and seeing them through to the end and making decisions based on long-term decisions. So how can LCR support the levelling up of the economy? Well, we're a public corporation, and we have certain freedoms that come with that. So we're a private company that's wholly owned by the DfT, and we have a clear mandate to support the government's drive to support new homes, jobs, and public value and levelling up the economy. So we're working hard to achieve this goal. There's particular focus in the north, and we are focused in some respects on Trans-Pennine Railway line, but we do work across England, and I think we're split regionally into northwest, northeast, and south, and the northwest and the northeast are some of our busiest areas infrastructurally right now. So in the northwest, we are looking in and around Greater Manchester, working with partners including Network Rail to a large degree. We've got 20 sites currently active there, and 120 acres of developable land and 3,000 homes, and that's looking in and around the kind of the Greater Manchester area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these slides earlier, but I think before I just wanted to talk about public value a little bit, which is we don't just assess our sites. Clearly there are no easy sites left on rail sites. They're done, so they're all hard. But one of the things we have become better at doing is, rather than just assessing from a financial point of view, the commercial, we have a public value assessment methodology which we're using to kind of as part of our business case, where we look at the commercial value, the social value to communities and citizens, and positive impact, and environmental value, and then the economic value. So we've got those four arms which we have metrics on, but then moreover looking at making them the way those component parts fit together to make more of the sum of their parts. So we're doing quite a lot in Rochdale. I know someone on the panel lives in Littleborough. We have a project there, and Castleton, Smithy Bridge, Rochdale Centre. We've got a great project working with partners looking at the levels above Rochdale to make a park on the tracks. So that's all really exciting stuff. We've got a history of starting with parks, and we've talked about Manchester, but King's Cross equally. And so it's great to be involved in those kind of community starting processes, and that kind of run from west to east across the Pennines is kind of a great place to be involved. Stafford Station Gateway, we're looking at, that's one of our larger master plans, looking at bringing all the area on the west side of the railway line back into use, and making all the complex sites there work together and get the best from what's kind of an underused size of the station. And then Chester City Gateway, that's looking at bringing in sites that in and around kind of quite spread around the city, and trying to make sense of those all together and bring those kind of unify them in a way across the city, and bring those into use. So I think that's enough. I just think within all those, I think collaboration, the most important, starting looking outwardly, the public value and what that is bring there, and unlocking sites, complex sites that would otherwise be underutilized.
Thanks very much, Stephen, for that. Once again, at one of our infrastructure intelligence webinars, this whole concept of social value, public value, is coming out loud and clear I think it's certainly an issue that we will be returning to repeatedly. I also personally think it's one that our sector needs to leverage much more, because I think it's actually quite good ground for the construction and infrastructure sector to actually show in a real dynamic way the benefits that it actually provides to society. And I know the government is obviously paying more attention to all matters social value, but I think we need to make sure that we actually demonstrate that in everything that we do as a sector as well. I'm sure we'll come back as well, Stephen, to some of those points that you raised around collaboration, because everything that you do, and you mentioned a number of projects in different areas of the country, it just wouldn't work without collaboration. And I think it'll be interesting to have some further discussion on the panel about that a little bit later on. Our next speaker is Ruth Jeff, and Ruth is the Regional Director for Infrastructure and the Environment at Waterman. Ruth specialises in the appraisal and delivery of placemaking and transport schemes to support a range of residential, commercial, educational, health, cultural and retail developments around her region and indeed around the country. And I'm sure she's someone who is very well versed in dealing with a diverse stakeholder sort of groupings, and I'm sure she'll talk a little bit about that when she speaks as well. I believe that Ruth is also the chair of the Association for Consultancy and Engineering's Midlands group, and obviously she's logging on today from Birmingham. So Ruth, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Yes, in terms of how I'm going to approach this, I'm going to put a bit of a Midlands spin. Since we've talked about the North and the South divide, the Midlands, of course, is there in the middle. So I'll just raise the profile while I have the opportunity. I'm also going to touch a little bit on some of the ACE task force work that's currently ongoing in my broader role as a board member of the ACE. So in the West Midlands, the mayor and the local authorities are responding to the needs and wants of local people to form an actual bridge from the COVID pandemic to a productive future. And it's very much about being driven from the bottom up. What is that local needs? And this is particularly relevant in the theme we've heard so far, how we've all changed with COVID. We do work and live closer together now. So this levelling up agenda is based around the concerns and aspirations of the local people, which identifies 6 priorities for the region. Now, a key ask for government is for more devolved spending and powers. It's to deliver locally, including a 1.5 billion capital programme over the next 5 years for transport as part of an actual single pot. So instead of doing it on an individual discipline basis, whether that's transport or housing, it's actually pulling it together and focusing on what's the critical enabling infrastructure, whether that be transport, housing, energy, natural capital, of course, and digital connectivity. So the UK government has committed a number of funds, some of which have recently been superseded, of course, by the initial 4.8 billion that's been promised for the Levelling Up Fund across the UK over the next 4 years, up to 2025. Now, investment decisions from government for the first round of that funding are expected this autumn. So bids have just gone in. So that's something for us all to be aware of and to keep lobbying, of course, over the next few months so that we have those pipelines coming through across the UK. So the West Midlands itself is looking for enhanced local responsibility and powers, of course, for the development, management and operation of the regional transport system to provide that gap between the national connectivity and the active travel with walk and cycling, as well as enforcing moving traffic offences and pavement parking, and is actually looking to keep those revenue streams local so that they can be used for local purposes. In addition to the asks for more control in delivering good transport and access, of course, to green spaces, which we've already heard about, the plans go further, setting out an agenda for reimagined town centres and vibrant cities with coordinated public sector intervention, unlocking all those new possibilities and supporting communities. But what we don't want, of course, is development for development's sake. The ACE recognises that the consultancy and engineering sector can provide a unique contribution to the levelling up challenge. We are currently looking at infrastructure in the built environment of those places left behind, compared to international case studies, and how these successes may be tailored to the UK and each specific region and devolved nation, of course. So a task force has been set up to share insights that improve public policy in this area, and also ensure our members are well positioned to capture work from the levelling up agenda. From my perspective, for the levelling up agenda to work, to be successful, we do need to focus on return from investment, not just the level of funding. So I was pleased to hear what Steve was talking about earlier from the LCR perspective. And I think we do need to put more focus on those elements. And of course, the net zero goal targets now. And in addition to this, supporting this, policy design and implementation must also be light, quick and agile. So the overall aim is to create, of course, business growth, harness technologies where we can, and regenerate communities so that people, like all of us, choose to live in them. So back to you, Andy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ruth. Interesting to hear you mention and give a special plug for the Midlands, because often this whole debate around levelling up can get skewed if we're not careful, between just the bald north-south kind of division, and as everybody knows, there are areas that haven't had the development that they should have had or even need in all areas of the country, both in the south and in the north, and obviously in the Midlands as well. So I think we do need to to highlight that as well. It'll be interesting in the discussion to hear what people think about that, and whether or not there is an opportunity for our industry to actually influence some of that spend as well, because I think its remit is quite wide in terms of what it can be spent on, and I know there's a number of different sectors, not just ours, who are eyeing up the levelling up fund as well. So and it sounds a lot, but when you actually sort of divvy it up, it's probably not not as much as actually needed. But I think again some food for thought there. But Ruth, for the time being, thanks very much. Our next speaker is Shawn Keys, who's the managing director of Sutcliffe. Sutcliffe are a structural and civil engineering firm based in Liverpool. I've spoken to Shawn on a number of occasions in the past, and I know that he's a passionate advocate for his region, for his city, and also for his industry as well. And Shawn is also currently the chair of ACE Northwest, and he's had plenty to say in the past about issues like the Northern Powerhouse, the levelling up agenda, and also the post-COVID environment, which let's hope we're all about to enter. Shawn, over to you.
Right, thank you and good morning to everybody. My name's Shawn Keys. I'm Managing Director of Sutcliffe Civil and Structural Engineers, based at northwest of England, but we've got offices in Liverpool, Manchester, North Wales and London. I also have the privilege of being the Regional Northwest Chair, so for the purpose of this, I'm going to take the Northwest as my battle axe, and I will take that forward. In terms of placemaking, it's where we all live, and it's something that has been continuing to improve and develop over the years. And I think what's happened over the previous 16 months, if Andy's calculations are correct with COVID, I do fervently believe the world is changing and will change. So in terms of placemaking, on a very basic level, everybody has the right to a quality home. And as part of their placemaking, I believe everybody should have access and facilities to good schools, good education, and then also the opportunity of a good job. So those things need to be tied together. My personal interests are more around probably homes and education, and NHS. That's probably what we tend to get involved in. So in terms of quality homes for all, so that doesn't mean the super rich, and it doesn't mean the people at the bottom, it means everybody. So what we managed to do during the COVID period, we managed to get everybody off the streets and give them a home. So being one of the richest countries in the world, we should have everybody homed. This isn't political. It's a disgrace we haven't got anybody homes. It creates wealth, it creates jobs. It actually makes the world a more balanced place. So in terms of homes, we've built over £1 billion worth of homes within my home region, and they've all been quality homes. They've ranged from homes for millionaires down to social residential social landlords. And something that's been a changing pattern is we've built extra care facilities for people in between hospital and homes, which are fantastic. We'll all end up there. And we're very, very proud of that sort of change. So we want to build homes for everybody from the beginning of their life through to the end. I think as Stephen was saying, there isn't an easy building site, which I'm actually quite pleased at, because from a professional perspective, that creates work for us. There's huge demand. I was chatting to an architectural friend yesterday. The services that an engineer now has to produce before he can make his planning application are greater. So we get involved in flooding and flood risk assessments and drainage assessments and infrastructure assessments. So in terms of a couple of hospitals that we're involved in, we found that the civil engineering around the site, including the drainage works, we've had difficulties with some of the statutory authorities because they have slightly different demands, but the whole process of that isn't tied up because we're building hospitals, but then the infrastructure, the road infrastructure around the edge of the sites is not particularly strong enough to take the new traffic. I'm just going to go off in a slight tangent, but in terms of the Northern Powerhouse and the levelling up agenda, I am a massive strong advocate that we should have a strong link between Liverpool, Manchester and London, and also Leeds, across the north and down to London. And one of the things that really makes me chuckle that I did this journey this week. It took me nearly an hour to travel from Liverpool to Manchester. But that was the same as when Stevenson did it nearly 200 years ago. Why haven't we improved? It just needs investment. So what we've done in recent years, we've spent a lot of money on infrastructure around London so we can move around London, which is massively important in terms of UK PLC. I really feel that we want London to be the strongest capital city in the world. So I'm not suggesting that we damage London, but we need more of that spend to filter to the regions, and it's a bit more evenly spread. I'd like to see politicians not bicker so much about it and be a bit more grown up about it. But again, this isn't a political spiel, but I would like to see that link between across the north and up from the north to be faster. Very crudely, what it would do for me personally on a personal level, if I decide I want to meet a new client in Leeds, it should only take me 40 minutes. It'll take me an hour and a half. I've lost 45 minutes of my time both ways. So that's something we can actually all think about, and hopefully that will happen over time. I think as Andy was saying, I was just checking the stats. I think the fund for the Levelling Up Fund, I think is £4.8 million, which equates to, I think I worked out about £50 or £70 per head a population in the UK, which isn't a huge number. But it's a move in the right direction. And I think that funding is targeting transport initiatives, regeneration towns and centres, and cultural investment. So I think certainly close to where I am, I think the Southport region is pushing for some of that investment. So there's been a lot of these little towns, the old Victorian towns around the perimeter of the UK that have missed out on investment, possibly as a result of COVID, prior to COVID, where people went abroad. As a result of COVID, these places are now becoming busy. So my final parting shot will be, is that as a result of COVID, I see that the world has changed. It will impact on placemaking and the levelling up agenda, and there are opportunities around it for our industry. And I see that the agenda has just moved up the pecking order. So the environment on the agenda item is more important. We all appreciate the community we live in more, so placemaking will be valued by most people to a higher degree. And I actually think the working place and working patterns have changed. So there's 3 opportunities for placemaking and levelling up that the public will demand that we have change for. And if I pass that back to you, if that's okay.
Thanks very much indeed, Shawn, for that. And interesting what you were framing placemaking in the concept of what needs to be done, and also what this industry does. I mean, it's really easy, I think, to get bogged down in new buzzwords and stuff like that, you know, whether it's leveling up, you know, whether it's you know, even placemaking as well. You know, I think, you know, at the end of the day, what we're talking about delivering here is things that people need to actually live. So I think, you know, I think it's really important to actually raise things in that kind of a way. And also, we've not discussed it yet. I'm sure it'll come up in the discussion. The rail link. There's been a lot of talk about Northern Powerhouse Rail, and as someone who's spent well, half their life in the north and half their life in London, it really pains me that we don't have a well invested, affordable and fast train service across the northern region. And, you know, that can only be because it's been discriminated against. And if that's political, then it's political. But the fact of the matter is we should have dealt with it by now, and we haven't. And hopefully in this post-COVID environment that we're entering into, that we will actually get the investment that's needed as far as that is concerned. There's probably room for us to have a separate conversation altogether on transport connectivity in the north, and who knows, maybe we will. But thanks very much for now, Shawn, for that contribution. Our final speaker is Kevin Whitmore from the communications consultancy BECG. Kevin heads up their North and Midlands, I'll call it a division, but he may well call it something else. Kevin is an experienced communications consultant specializing in planning communications, political advocacy, and community campaigning for a range of clients across the built and natural environment. And he's got more than a decade's experience of working with various clients in the public and private sectors, and to working with local communities as well. So he knows all about stakeholder engagement and bringing different sections of society together around the issue of the built environment. So Kevin, it's your turn next.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning, everybody. I think what I wanted to do to start off with is just to sort of really try and think about what is the problem that we're trying to solve. Levelling up is a bit of a buzzword that certainly Boris Johnson has used for a few years now, but I think we have to really start to think about what is the issue before we can start to think about solutions. And there was a really useful report that was published last year by the Onward think tank, which includes Neil O'Brien MP, who is now the government's sort of advisor on levelling up. And there's a few stats that I just wanted to pull out to really set the context of the debate that we're talking about, really. And until 2004, London's economy was roughly the same size as the North's in GDP terms. But then all that changed. And just before the start of COVID-19, London's economy was the same size as the North, plus Edinburgh's, plus Swansea, plus Belfast, plus Bristol, and plus Birmingham. And that's borne out in data for individuals as well. So pre-tax and benefit income per person in London grew 2/3 faster than the rest of the North over the last 20 years or so, give and take, and is now 70% higher in London than the rest of the country. And in contrast, in places like South Yorkshire, Teesside and Merseyside, GDP per person fell by 20% compared to the national average between the 70s and the mid-90s. And there's also been a change in population as well. So the population in London is increasing by nearly 1/3 from the 80s, whilst parts of the population in the north have only increased by less than 1% in some areas. London's getting younger, whilst the rest of the country is getting older. And we've discussed before the problems that creates from a brain drain perspective, with graduates going to base themselves down in the capital city. And I suppose all this results in the fact that we've got a geographically unbalanced country and the opportunities aren't evenly spread. So I think, you know, levelling up is there to address that problem. But from a political perspective, there's a real sort of political challenge for the Conservative Party as well, because the seats gained by the Tories in 2019 and Boris Johnson smashed through this supposed red wall, those seats that they won, they don't just have a lower earnings rate than seats that the Conservative Party already held. They have earnings that are 5% lower than seats that Labour hold. And of the bottom quarter of seats in Great Britain with the lowest earnings, the Conservatives now represent more than Labour. And those seats also have a lower employment rate than seats held by Labour at the last election, and a higher unemployment rate than seats held by Labour as well. And my final stat, when you look at the seats that the Conservatives gained in 2019 compared to the seats held by Labour, a house costs £62,000 more on average, roughly 1/3 higher in seats held by Labour than in seats held by the Conservatives. So there's a real sort of political incentive for the government to try and address this problem if voters in the North and across the Midlands that perhaps voted Conservative for the first time are going to do so again at the next election. So what's happening? Well, we've all discussed a lot of things: levelling up funds, free ports, the relocation of the civil service to different parts of the North, to places like Wolverhampton, Darlington and Leeds. But I'm not entirely convinced that any of that is really going to answer the problem and address the problem that I've just set out. And perhaps there's a bit of smoke and mirrors coming out of government at the moment when it comes to levelling up. We've just talked about connectivity and the train lines between Liverpool and Leeds and Northern Powerhouse Rail. I was in my Birmingham office yesterday. I live in Greater Manchester. It takes 2.5 hours on the train to get from where I am in Greater Manchester to Birmingham at the moment. You know, a problem that needs to be addressed. Yet, Transport for the North, the body that was meant to be set up to really tell government what we need to deliver the investment and connect all of the region together, that's had its funding cut, and we're still no further to hearing what announcements we're going to get regarding Northern Powerhouse Rail and the eastern leg of HS2. The devolution white paper still hasn't materialised. That was meant to reset how local government was going to be restructured and potentially devolve more powers to the likes of Andy Street, which Ruth was sort of talking about earlier. Planning reform, whether we think it's a good thing or a bad thing, it's not. We don't know what it is yet. It's been delayed. That's not happened as quickly as it was all meant to. You know, we still don't have a Northern Powerhouse minister or a levelling up minister in cabinet. It's still people sort of thinking about this when they've got time to think about it. So I do think there's more that government can do. But I also think there's more that the private sector and the local government can do as well to try and address some of these challenges. And I think as built environment professionals, you know, we all know the power of place, both from an identity point of view, but also places where business and people want to be. So I think placemaking does have a role to play in levelling up. People are more likely to understand and identify with their own town, their own city, their own local authority. I think even city regions are now becoming better known and better recognised, and that was, I suppose, evidenced in the increased turnout at the mayoral elections earlier this year. And as professionals, we all know which local authorities in the parts of the country that we work in are more forward-thinking, more used to collaborating with the private sector, and those that aren't. And I think it's down to us all to sort of roll our sleeves up and help politicians, council officers, planning departments, and give them the ammunition to help create the places that we all want to live, work, create jobs, kickstart the drive to net zero, raise skills. So I think a big part of the answer to this question is that collaboration, and somebody else mentioned it earlier, between the private sector and really local government, through investment in the places that we all live. It is houses, it is skills, it is transport infrastructure, it is net zero, it's all of this. But unless I think we do a better job of bringing communities with us, I think, you know, the biggest barrier to some of this isn't government, actually. I think it's actually the communities sometimes where we're wanting to invest and level up, because they don't necessarily draw the dots between this investment happening and the benefits that will come in the years to come. So I think I'll stop talking there, Andy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin, for that. And I thought those stats that you talked about there, you know, which illustrated some of the change in demographics and political demographics, were really fascinating, actually. It's the first time I've heard some of those. But I think the political imperative that you spoke about, I think, is important for our industry to grasp, because it does actually show, I hope, that the government will actually put some of its shoulder behind its promises to invest in in some of these areas, because, you know, frankly, if it doesn't, then obviously it won't be the government anymore, is essentially what you're saying in relation to those stats that you reeled off earlier. Just to say to people, if you've got any questions, then please post them in the chat, and we'll get to them during the course of the discussion. I want to start off, though, with a question that you touched on, Kevin, when you just spoke, and that's on the issue of planning. The government, clearly planning is extremely important in relation to the whole placemaking agenda, and the government are on record as saying that they want to overhaul the planning the planning regulations, and the planning white paper came out several months ago, but we were yet to see the full detail of that. I've just put the question, first of all, to Anya, in relation to your thoughts on where the government is with its planning reforms, and where do you expect them to go, and are they heading in the right direction in relation to that?
I think it's quite a thorny issue, to be honest with you, Andy. They're not moving quick enough. I think we can all agree that. We're left actually dealing with, and I think Stephen and Shawn both said, difficult sites that we need to deal with, and we need to make them attractive for both public and private sector investors to invest in them and redevelop them. Instead of going for the greenfield areas outside, we have to deal with the connectivity and the drive of growth within the areas that people are living and working, and how we improve that for them to drive that stimulus that we have coming out. There was a relaxation in the planning laws about, you know, repurposing of buildings and how they pull across. We could be left with large areas of cities and town centres that have nothing in them, and not attractive, not secure, not welcoming, and not great for well-being. So we've been talking about planning reform and planning change in different guises. It seems to be a recurring theme every couple of years, and we don't seem to get a proper answer out of it. It doesn't seem to keep up with the need and demand that we have coming across. We need to lobby and make something different for our communities and our citizens, so they can make the best of the areas that they live, ensure they're safe, prioritize sustainable type modes of transport, whether it be walking, a woman walking in a city centre, or a man or a child that doesn't have sufficient lighting, sufficient security, and doesn't prioritize pedestrians over traffic, makes it really dangerous and unsafe. And it improves our well-being if we have larger avenues and areas that we can walk, more green spaces, areas that we want to gather, areas that we just don't want to live and work. We have to play, we have to have fun, we have to have that social activity. I think it needs to come quicker. I think it needs to be much more locally based about the needs of the areas that they're looking to attract and deal with, and focus on the improvements, those small changes that we can make that will make significant difference to the majority of the people. And it needs to be brave. The one thing that we really need now is bravery to step in and make the differences that we need to make for our generation and the generations to come. So hurry up and get it out there, hurry up and get some consultation on it, and let's get on with the job that we really want to do.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Anya, for that. If I just turn to you for a moment on this issue, Stephen, I know you're obviously working closely with government organisations. What are your thoughts, your observations on where we are with planning, and how is that going to help us level up?
Well, similar to Anya, I think there's there's a need for positive change, and there's a need for some change. It's been talked about a lot, but I think ultimately when you'll work within the whatever comes and solve it. I think there's a few things which are, I mean, the planning and planners have been bashed for quite a long time, and I think that has been slightly unfortunate, and it's been blamed for a lot. And I think there's some areas which would help. I mean, there's the skills of planners, there's resourcing of planning authorities, and there's some kind of stigmatization. I mean, the amount of times I've heard, oh, the planners want this. So I think the way we try and approach it is we really try and work with the authority and try and support kind of their objectives. And I think whatever the answer is, I think, and however the government's trying to get to it, I think there's quite a lot of placemaking within the new within the changes. So it's mentioned a lot in coding, and so there's some drive to get that. But I think there's within particularly local authorities, which will still remain approvers to a certain degree, depending on the powers. I think there's a real need to work together with kind of their objectives. We find there are a lot of challenges on density and deliverability and appetite for that. But again, I mean, that comes down to what Kevin was talking about earlier, and kind of working with locally, because if people in the local area don't support what you're doing because it's really tall, then like you question whether it's the right thing, and that the council kind of representing that view is important. I think we find on a lot of our sites we do need outside help and funding and support, and I think many people will be finding that. But don't know what the answer is, but I think there's a real need to support the kind of skills resourcing and kind of not bashing planners enough, but giving more support, because that plan making can really kind of help speed up development.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Ruth, what's your observations on this particular issue? Do you have confidence that the government are going to get this right? We know it's a thorny issue. You're never going to please everyone in relation to planning, but nevertheless, the government have said have they not, that they want to use the planning system to basically deal with some of these issues that we're talking about today, particularly around the question of levelling up?
I actually feel that the planners have got a really important role to play in this, of course. And if we can get the right support in from government policy to support planners, that will be very welcome. I think just looking at it from the opposite lens, from talking to some planners recently on several different developments around the Midlands, they actually get very disappointed in developers actually and the resulting developments, because a lot of the time developments are put forward that they're very excited about and are keen to progress, and subsequently those do get support from local communities, they do get planning permissions, but then when it comes to actually delivering them, the issue of viability crops up again. So I do think this idea of collaboration and making sure development's not for development's sake, but has that long-term investment value, and maybe similar to what we have with an infrastructure fund to enable brownfield sites. Maybe there's some other gap funding there that we need to think a little bit differently going forward and actually provide some support to the planning process itself.
Thanks, Ruth. I think that the point about not having development for development's sake is really important, and it sort of moves on to this whole area of how do we make sure that what we are doing in this area of levelling up, of placemaking, is actually doing the job that we want it to do. Just ask Shawn whether he has any thoughts on how do we take people with us, and I'll come to Kevin next on this as well. How do we ensure that we take people with us around some of these developments that are being proposed, and that they actually do the job that they're actually designed to do?
It's a good question, that. What I've found is that the different regions definitely have different problems. So if you go from slightly an old industrial region to a more affluent area, or to London, you've got slightly different problems with them. But in terms of placemaking and taking people with them, I found that we've had the greatest success when you give people what they want, but you give them a time to get their head around that process of what they want. And something that we've touched on is that it doesn't take too long to get there, so they haven't got bored with it. So if we're transforming an area, we're regenerating an area, feed it in the local press or the national press, depending on the scale of it. But it needs to happen when they say they're going to it's going to happen, and not for it to be too long. But I actually think that most people in the public, I know we all complain when we're part of the public about what's happening with the development side, but understand that we need quality homes, we need quality facilities, quality schools. So I think the general public would accept that we're going to do it, but they probably want it to be done in not overnight. But if we say it's going to take 12 months or 2 years, it should take 12 months or 2 years, not 5 or 6 years. And I think the other thing that most people want is they want us to build on the brownfield sites. And the problem that we all know with a construction, infrastructure, engineering background, they typically cost more, and probably maybe there should be more funding available or more tax breaks to enable that to happen. So hopefully that keeps the debate going, Andy.
Thanks very much for that. I want to turn to Kevin, because I know Kevin has quite a lot of involvement in working with communities and persuading people of the benefits of development. How do you think we're doing in this area, and what do you think more needs to be done to make sure that we get that public acceptance? How do we engage the public around some of these issues?
So I think it is a challenge, isn't it? Because you look at the British Social Attitude Survey that comes out every year, and the government, asks people, the question, do you support, new housing in your local area? And the percentage of people answering that positively has increased over the last decade. Yet, I think, in my experience, when it comes down to individual projects and individual sites, the challenge only seems to get tougher year on year. So there's clearly a mismatch between sort of in principle position that people have, an acknowledgement that there's a need to invest in the local environment, but that when it comes down to that specific site that's going to impact me on a personal basis, it's a lot harder to bring people through that process. Clearly, the last 12 months, we've all been engaging and talking to people differently to what we were doing before the pandemic. And I really hope we don't lose the gains that we've made through going towards a more digital process, both in terms of engaging with communities, but also I think for the local authorities as well. And part of the planning reform that might be coming down the track is to really embed some of that digitisation in the process, which I think can only be a positive. I think there's a need, and it comes down to resource and skills within local authorities actually, for local authorities to engage more fulsomely at the local plan stage. And I think if that was done with more time, more budget behind it, and actually we could bring people through that journey that Shawn spoke about. That is the real time that many communities can influence what is going to happen within their community more generally. And if we can bring people through that process a bit better, I think that can be helpful. But I think it also comes down to our clients having the time and the inclination sometimes to want to engage communities positively and bring them on that journey that Shawn mentioned, because unfortunately there are many times when consultation with the community becomes that tick box towards the end of a process that has to be done, and invariably it's in that mindset that then leads to people thinking, well, is it worth my time engaging in this process meaningfully, or are you just ticking a box to get a planning application submitted? So I think the earlier you can engage, the better. And the more that you can demonstrate that engagement has led to change, and the final product is different as a result of that process, helps. But going back to the earlier part of your discussion, Andy, nobody really knows what the planning reforms are going to say later on down the track. I read William Hague this week saying that planning reform could be Boris Johnson's poll tax, which doesn't really bear well when we think what might be coming down the track. But yeah, I suppose we have to wait and see.
Thanks very much, Kevin, for that. I'm going to bring Stephen in because he's got his hand up, and then I'm going to ask him a question as well, because I want to talk a little bit about transport as well, which we haven't yet covered, but I think it's an important aspect in relation to placemaking and also the levelling up agenda. But Stephen, you had your hand up there.
Just to kind of build on what Kevin was talking about, and I think kind of what beyond housing are some of these sites delivering for local people, and then how many times have we seen a phasing structure because they are challenged sites where, guess what, all the housing gets built but all the good stuff at the end 5 years down the line still isn't built, and that's kind of lost a lot of trust. I think our sites are mainly based around stations.
Sorry, Stephen, just to interject there, because I hear that a lot. Why is that though? I mean, surely we have some of the best minds. Some of them were on this webinar, but why do they not get it right?
It depends who they is, but I was going to go back and finish what I was saying, then I might come on to that, or let someone else ask that really difficult question. But I think something we're starting to think about. I mean, we're involved around stations, which has started as being a really civic building and a really important part of communities, and so looking to bring them back into kind of within the heart of centres and trying to get more, even if it's just a shop or someone to buy milk or something like that around them, but really looking at what could be around there and reorganizing things that so they're not empty late night, and what should be there and how's it going to support our economy. And I think that there's an important part of studying what's there and what needs to be there, and not having community space for community space sake, but like who's local, who needs something. So that's something we in Stockport we particularly put a lot of work into, that doesn't need to go into kind of a public space soon. But I think that's and then making sure that it's phased in a way that does deliver it. And I think that's part of I think coming back to that challenging question about why is that, I think there's some of it is in developer terms, it's what can we get away easy, and then what kind of runs over the term of the planning life. But in terms of our schemes, which are really partnerships with the local authority, who in the case of Stockport would be running those community spaces, for example, so they would take the lease on that. The station would clearly, Network Rail wants to improve their asset, and so I think the answer is more engaging more of the partners who might be operating some of the long-term things, and those things are what people in communities can engage with, because they're real tangible benefits to some of these schemes.
Thanks for that. I saw that Anya had a nod of recognition when Stephen flagged up this, these challenges with staging of stuff and not getting the good stuff at the end of it. Have you got any thoughts on why you think that is and what we can do about it?
I think there's a lot of things around that, Andy. To be honest with you, it's a very complicated type scenario. It's a little bit to do with getting something started and maybe not having all the funding and recognition that you've got pulling across. It could be something to do with the product itself that has been pushed across is part of a bigger scenario, and that has not been realized. So it may be the first phase of something that's much more significant to happen, but that's been pushed down the road for whatever reason, whether it is funding, whether it is appetite, whether it is there's been issues getting planning or whatever actually to push that across. And an awful lot of these things depend on that economic revenue coming in. So if you build a housing estate and you say you're going to put a park in and you're going to have all these areas around, quite a lot of that sometimes depends on the uptake of the housing and how that actually interconnects and the changing needs of what people pull across. And I think it really pushes out a very strong need of a plan and a vision for an area that they need to deal with. So when you have that strong inclusion vision of what you're doing, and you have that interlinking, that systems of systems interlinking about what you're trying to develop, and the city stakeholders working together to really drive that development, I think that's where you will start seeing the differences on actually getting what you require at the end of it, and projects being followed through. But there's a lot of issues that can stop everything being realized, and I think the city leaders really need to stop and have a look at that and see what they can do in that planning and that vision for the area to combat that, and also in the phasing of how they actually go about it.
Thanks, Anya. It seems to me that transport is a key part of a lot of the levelling up and placemaking agenda, and I think we've seen in the recent period. Obviously, transport has been looked at somewhat differently when we've not been able to use any of it. But as we come out of COVID, then clearly, that will become, I think, more important. What do the panel think about the use of transport to influence placemaking and regional development? And I know that a number of you have mentioned already. The parlor state of the rail network in the north, but it's not just about major rail routes as well. There's all sorts of stuff around light rail as well, which I for the life of me can't understand why we don't have more of that, although I can imagine it's quite complex to put forward. I know that obviously there's a project of that type underway at the moment in the Midlands, around the West Midlands Metro, but just on a broader sense, if I come to you, Ruth, first, the role of transport in all of this, in levelling up, in placemaking, how do we ensure that we get that you know, on the agenda, and how important do you think it is?
Yeah, so I have to agree, Andy, it's crucial. We talk about the national rail network, which traditionally was always focused on London, of course, because that's how it makes its money to fund other network enhancements. We're now looking at regional level enhancements, be it Northern Powerhouse, be it the Midlands Connect, of course, which is focusing on enhancing east-west links and getting the benefits out of HS2 and embedding those in the region. But we need to look forward now as well, because we've got the active travel. We talk about the 20-minute neighbourhoods, which is based on the France-Paris 50-minute neighbourhoods, of course. So we're looking at the 20-minute neighbourhoods now. But what about those areas in between? And this particularly is important for those rural areas around the conurbations, for the levelling up agenda, particularly as we're looking to move to electric vehicles as well with our net zero goals. A lot of those areas, those deprived areas, are actually reliant on a car at the present moment for some of those journeys. If we make that difficult as we move to electric vehicles, of course, they're great, but they're only good for relatively short journeys. And going across the Midlands is 80, 90 miles. It's only 40, 50 miles between Leeds and Manchester. It's a huge area. So we do need to get that right. And whilst we've got some hydrogen vehicles coming in to Coventry, for example, with a bus network, that's great and akin to Midland Metro, but we're still missing that level of transport to connect those very localized journeys, so that people can then make a medium length journey in a sustainable way, Andy.
Thanks, Ruth. Shawn, you mentioned particularly the rail network. So presumably you think it is an important aspect of all that we're talking about here. What's your observations on that?
I sat earlier in the week with the three chief execs of Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds. And what I think it allows people to do, it allows cross-fertilization of ideas and growth and economies. So if you're in one area of that swathe of land that I've been talking about today, and you need another engineer, but he lives in, let's say, Ramsbottom, and it's difficult to get from Ramsbottom down to over to Liverpool or Leeds, he doesn't take the job. So the employer misses out, and the person misses out, and then his community misses out. So that the better transport links improves the economy, improves placemaking. And I'd go further than that, and I'd say if we cut areas out of good transport links, they will be forgotten about, and then they will then become even a more deprived area. So we're not necessarily there now, and I don't think that's what I really want to push forward. But I'm saying that if I get my links from where I live and my geography of where I typically work across the north, if I can do that journey an hour quicker, that means I can effectively do an hour's more work every single day. And then obviously then it means I can recruit a few more people from a wider region, and it will help grow business in the region.
Thanks, Shawn. Just turning to Kevin, do you think the industry is vocal enough around lobbying opinion formers for some of this transport investment? Everyone talks about it. Everyone would agree that we need some of this investment, particularly across the northern region. And yet we're still talking about it, years and years later. And I think it was Shawn himself who made the point about the travel time is no different from what it was in Stevenson's day. What's going on? Why aren't the politicians listening?
It's a good question, isn't it? I think to be fair, I think that the region's business community has got better at shouting louder. And I think when you think about the Northern Powerhouse partnership, as one example of how they've sort of made a real difference in I suppose, raising the importance of this issue. I think, unfortunately, we have been the victim of just a civil service sort of mentality and algorithms and green book calculations that just mean that payback to any investment in large parts of the regions haven't had the same impact as they would have done in London and the southeast. But we have got a full a huge swathe of backbench Tory MPs now that we haven't had across the region for a long time. We've now got a swathe of local authorities that are now represented by the same party, and will presumably have their own links through to make our voices known a bit louder. So no, I think I see that business is doing what it can to try and move these types of decisions and reforms on. Unfortunately, a lot of the transport stuff is big ticket and long term. And therefore, that type of project is at odds with a political, parliamentary timetable, which means, we've got to get things done in the next 4 years, or support projects that are going to have an impact in a 4 to 5 year time frame to then make that difference at the next election. So I think I'm not sure there's much more we can do to shout a bit louder. And I suppose it's hold our MPs to account, hold their feet to the fire to make sure they're going out and sticking their elbows out for funding pots or decisions coming down the line.
Thanks, Kevin. I think one thing that we could do, that everybody could do, and this might be slightly barking at the moon, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think we should be arguing as an industry to politicians that they take a longer term view, because there are certain things that I don't think anyone can disagree with. I'm not saying they're not political. Everything's political when you get into politics. But nevertheless, I think some of these mega projects that we talk about, they should try and come to some kind of political consensus, and then take people with you around that as well, to actually show, unless you actually support this, you won't be getting elected. And I think if you look at some of the electoral campaigns that take place in different parts of the world, and I'm thinking America here, and I know that it's a different political system, but elections are won and lost on whether or not development takes place. People actually want to see stuff happening because it's going to benefit their lives. And I think, even when that's really difficult, big ticket stuff, as has been described, I think we do need to have that conversation with politicians and say, look, if we all agree on this, then we need to make sure that it actually happens. But maybe that's me being idealistic and naive. But nevertheless, I think it is something that needs to be looked at. Something I want to turn to now, as we sort of approach the end, and it's something that Anya mentioned earlier, and I think it's really important, and we haven't looked at it yet. And that's this question of affordability. Anya spoke about the need for development, the need for placemaking, and I think it also has a link back to the transport stuff. We can have the best transport system in the world, but if it costs you 150 quid to get to London, frankly, the vast majority of people are not going to use it. So whether it's about transport, whether it's about the wider placemaking agenda, and I'm going to kick off with Anya on this, just to explore this issue around affordability. What did you mean by that? And how do we get that out there to convince people what we're doing is the right thing?
Affordability is absolutely key, Andy. There's no point in us building things if they can't be used and people aren't making the most of them. We're coming out of a very tough time post-COVID. We need to give people hope. We need to give them a community. We need to allow them to reconnect. We've got to give them some way for that reconnection to actually happen. I think Shawn said it earlier as well. Everybody's got the right to live in a house. We got people off the streets. We drove inclusivity. Anything that we do needs to be inclusive of all communities and all citizens to make it drive that economic growth, to make it better. The transportation system comes very clearly into that. You do have NPR that's going to look at that Northern Powerhouse Rail and that connectivity down to London. But what that does, the benefit of that, is it frees up an awful lot of the network for more local journeys and better connections between those local cities and towns that we've got linking through. But we've also got to think of how we link those off to the radio and the rural towns that we have got for those communities to aspire and grow. And that's just not through rail. That can be through cycling, it can be through walking, it can be through trams, it can be through different avenues, but buses. Buses are actually really conceived to be electric hydrogen buses, to be affordable for people to be able to use to bring them across. And it's about that connectivity and about making it at a price that people can actually use it to get from A to B. The reason why you do that is to drive the economic growth, the pathway for that to happen around our regions and our towns as a stimulus. And it's also to be able to take those people who are living in the most deprived areas in our area and give them a way of getting out to find new work, to find development, to make those connections, to get them to better schools, to get them to better housing in areas that we can actually drive that growth for all. It is very much about that need of inclusivity and development for everybody in our society, just not the chosen few.
Thanks very much, Anya. Stephen, your views on this question of affordability. You've been involved in some big flagship projects around the country. Have they all been affordable for local people to get involved with?
I think King's Cross had a kind of a really was kind of really market leading in terms of its engagement with the local people and Somers Town and how it affected them and what it could bring. And I think that was really important, and that's also really important to build on. But I think particularly in up around Rochdale and what is kind of making sure that it's the right type of products that can be afforded, that it's market facing, that it's kind of what it's not just flooding the market, and it provides a range. I think that's something that we're clearly looking at and is a really important part of everything we do and trying to make that work. It's also a really important part of funding from Homes England and other sources that have been discussed today and kind of providing that product. Often it's really challenged, and we have a very kind of commercial skill within the organisation that kind of uses that as a starting point, and and Homes England now sit on our board for these projects. It's a really important to bring in government money to help support that, and it really is a big focus. I think I mean, just to agree with everything that's been said on the importance of the network and getting people to stations, but just I think there's one about improving the infrastructure, and then there is another really important skill in making sure that it has best effect when it lands, when it is improved. And I think that's really key, that you can get to the bus easily, that it's not confusing, that it's important, that there's housing near it, that there's a mix, that it feels great and part of the city and not imposed, it doesn't create severance issues. I think all of that. So we've talked about the big infrastructure and kind of getting it, but it needs to be managed in a really effective way. And I think one city that hasn't been mentioned, which has huge potential, is Bradford, in that link from Liverpool to Leeds, and there was kind of challenges raised about aging populations. Bradford is the youngest city in the UK. It has kind of the most tech skills, but it's not on the network, and it's all part of bringing that into this kind of connected, short journey time and affordable place where there are kind of opportunities that are currently missed.
Thanks, Stephen, for that. We are almost running out of time, so if I can just ask our panelists to be as brief as they can in sort of just wrapping up on this particular issue, that balance between commerciality and, I suppose, social value on one level. How do we best achieve that? And coming back to that point around affordability, I'll go to Shawn first on that. Are we getting the balance right? Are we getting the right messages across on that issue?
It depends which day of the week I am and who my client is. So I think affordability is a real problem. And unfortunately, if you're talking to a private speculative developer, he wants to make he really doesn't want to put as many affordable homes in, but there is typically in my region, there's a requirement to do that. If you talk to a residential social landlord, then they want 100% of the site to be affordable. So probably where I am is somewhere in the middle of all of that.
Okay, almost a metaphor for the consultancy sector in the industry there. Ruth, your thoughts, brief thoughts on that issue.
Yes, I mean, affordability is key, of course, and one thing, looking at the statistics behind the levelling up agenda, one of the biggest issues between the South and really the rest of the country is to do with property value, of course, and salaries. So there is an issue there, because there are then still sort of areas within the southeast that still do need that levelling up. In terms of affordability, one of those areas that is coming more and more forward in terms of developments is consideration for key worker accommodation. And that's something, of course, that's very important in terms of the agenda going forward as well.
Thanks very much, Ruth. I'm going to end with Kevin. You spoke earlier about some demographic changes and how that was feeding into a political imperative for the government to do something about this whole levelling up agenda, which is where we started off today. How confident do you think that our industry can be that actually the government will deliver on this issue? Big question, I know, but hey.
Well, shall we just say here's hoping? You know, I think there's, as I say, you know, it's not just, you know, we have to tackle this because it's a good thing that the country needs to do. I suppose we can reassure ourselves that there is that you know, cynical political calculation that something needs to be done. I think I would echo what's been said before about inclusivity, and I think from a comms perspective, thinking about how you communicate about your project, so that you're talking to people that might have different needs from a communications perspective, get them involved in the process, people that aren't hard to reach, groups that aren't used to doing that. And that then gives you a different perspective when it comes to affordability and what type of development accommodation you might be wanting to put forward, which can then perhaps bring different voices to play and different avenues to build support for your development. Thanks
very much, Kevin. We've run out of time as always. I'd just like to thank all of our panelists for their time this morning, to Anya Martin, I beg your pardon, from MacDonald, Stephen Tomlinson from LCR, Ruth Jeff from Waterman, Shawn Keys from Sutcliffe, and also Kevin Whitmore from BECG, our strategic partners for this, and indeed all of our infrastructure intelligence live events. The next event is coming hot on the heels of this one next Wednesday, where we will be looking at the changing face and role of consultancy, engineering consultancy in particular, with the launch of the new Consultancy 4.0 campaign that's been launched by ACE next week. So if you're working in the consultancy sector, or if you work with consultants in our industry, and that's pretty much everyone, let's face it, log on next Wednesday for that event. I think it's been a really excellent and interesting discussion today, as always. Thanks very much indeed to our panelists. It's an issue that I'm sure we will return to, because as Kevin has pointed out, we can hope that the government actually delivers on this agenda, but time will tell. And I think our industry, indeed, like many other sectors, will need to hold the government to account on its promises and on its levelling up agenda. But until next time, it's me, Andy Walker, the editor of Infrastructure Intelligence, saying goodbye. Have a good weekend. I hope the sun shines wherever you are, and that you manage to get some quality time in over the weekend. So thanks very much indeed. Goodbye, and thanks to everybody. Bye-bye now.